to Financial Minds Meet the Experts. I'm Jaime Agostino. As you know, on this podcast, we're joined by financial industry experts to talk about topics, trends, and themes that credit union professionals need to know about. They are back, and I'm excited to hear what these two have to say. Joining me today are Tim Sustak, SVP, Chief Treasury Officer, and Scott Wood, SVP, Chief Investment Officer with Vizo Financial. Scott, Tim, thanks for being here.
Yeah, thank you,
Thanks.
Jaime.
All right, so Scott, I'm going to ask, what are the key economic data points the Fed will likely weigh most heavily going into next week's meeting?
So I think, we've been talking about what to look at over the last few months as the Fed may or may not raise rates or lower rates and what they might do. So I think the biggest contributor to this upcoming meeting is going to be the jobs data, right? They have their dual mandate, so they look at inflation, they track that closely, and then they track the jobs data. So on a monthly basis, on the first Friday of each month, we get the jobs report out that tells us basically, it gives us a lot of data, but there's a couple key metrics there that the Fed will look at. One is the unemployment rate. The unemployment rate is still in pretty good territory. If you just looked at the unemployment rate, which some members of the FOMC basically have said that's what they look at, is the unemployment rate. If you just look at that, things look fine on the employment front. The unemployment rate now is 4.3%. Historically, that's in the range you would expect it to be in a normal functioning economy. So on its face, that's not a bad thing to do, that would move the Fed. But the other part of the jobs report to look at is the number of jobs that were created in the preceding month when that comes out. And that's really where the issue lies here. And what we've seen here recently is that rate has not been, that number has not been very strong. The last 4 months, I think the highest month we had was 79,000 new jobs created. We had a month where we lost jobs. The most recent report, I think, was in the low 20,000 jobs, 22,000 jobs created. Those are low numbers and signs that the labor market is weakening. So I think the Fed members of the FOMC are going to have to take a look at that and factor that into their decision to cut rates. They're certainly going to factor in other things, right? They're still going to look at the inflation data, and that's where they could get into a little bit of a dilemma, right? If we see this weakening employment data, again, the unemployment rate's good, but the other data starting to see weakness there. But the issue arises if we continue to see this increase in inflation. So then the Fed has this dilemma, and that's kind of what the members have been fighting with here recently is, what do they give more weight to? Last month we had a couple dissenters last meeting, and that was really based on the jobs data, not the unemployment rate, but they saw the jobs market weakening. So that's why they dissented. Or their stated reason for that. But a lot of the other folks were really focused on the inflation. So I think what we're going to see at this next meeting is more of a focus on the employment data, and really it's going to be on the jobs created. So that should be probably the key factor, I think, in what their decision ultimately comes down to.
Okay. Well, Scott, that kind of leads right into my next question here for Tim. So, Tim, what's your read on how unified or divided the Fed might be heading into the upcoming meeting?
Yes, it's a great question, Jamie. And I think, I would say they have been certainly very divided. I think there's some evidence to that. But they may be becoming less so. We can talk about that a little as well. I mean, I say they're divided. They certainly were very divided for a number of reasons, right? I mean, we saw the June dot plot. 7 of 19 thought that there would be no cut, and 8 of 19 were expecting 225 basis point cuts before the end of the year, right? So very divided there. As Scott said, we had the two dissents during the last meeting, which is the first time in I think 30 years that we had two dissenters. So that certainly signals division. We recently got the Fed minutes, October 20th for the July meeting. Very disparate commentary there on key issues, things like inflationary impact of tariffs, right? Some still see it as, hey, we think it's going to be short-lived. Others think, well, could be longer. Some are willing to act now. Some are saying, hey, we really need to continue to wait and see more information to make sure that inflation doesn't get out of hand, right? So divided on that, certainly divided on the jobs market. As Scott said, some are seeing the low job creation numbers and saying, hey, things are kind of falling apart here. Some are saying, hey, the unemployment rate is still very good. I mean, what, 4.2, 4.3%, I think it ticked up to in this last reading, a number of years ago when we were kind of on the way down from high unemployment. I mean, everybody would have said, hey, 4.3%, we're at full employment, no problem here. So, I think, there certainly was a lot of division. I think it's becoming less so. And the reason is, I think, exactly what Scott talked about, the fact that, we have been seeing these kind of persistently degrading jobs numbers, which are creating questions, right, about what's going to happen. We haven't seen a drastic impact of tariffs, right? I mean, inflation hasn't gone bonkers. It's been, I would say, it's probably been tamer than most originally thought it would be from tariff actions. You had Chair Powell at his Jackson Hole speech certainly left the door open there for a September rate cut, mentioning that, hey, based on data, it looks like the balance of risk could, be turning and that it would be appropriate to ease monetary policy. And then I just read that, John Williams, president of the New York Fed, had come out and said, hey, yeah, it's, data looks like it probably favors a cut. So it looks like he's in that camp. And, the president of the Fed New York Bank always has a fairly loud voice because they're key in implementing monetary policy. They're a permanent voting member of the FOMC. So where I think they were very divided, I think kind of coming into the next meeting in September, they're probably getting a little more on the same page. That's my read.
Okay. All right. Thank you. I have to ask about political pressure. So, Scott, how much political pressure is the Fed under?
Yeah, it's a tricky question, and I think part of it too is we all assume the Fed is not political, not a political body, but
Right.
I think historically speaking, we would probably say they're not super political, but I think there's some level of politics involved with the Fed, right? They're appointed by the members of the Federal Reserve are appointed by the president. But they're on staggered terms, so one president may appoint more than another president. People resign and all these other things. So obviously there's some politics involved there, but I would say the Fed goes out of the way to try to be apolitical. They want to make decisions that are based on the data. They want to show that they're separate from political pressure. And I think Chairman Powell has done a pretty good job of navigating that. Obviously, they're getting a lot of political pressure coming from the administration. President Trump has not been shy about saying how, I think he calls him too late Powell, meaning he's waiting too long to cut rates. He should have done this a long time ago. He's put a lot of pressure out there. He's talked about firing Powell. Then he said, I'm not going to fire Powell. Right now there's an active attempt to get Lisa Cook off of the Federal Reserve Board. I read, I think yesterday or the day before, where the Justice Department has launched a probe. So she's being investigated for the potential mortgage fraud. And, we could debate whether that's an issue that means you should be off of the Federal Reserve or not. There's probably some political element to that, right? She was appointed by Biden. Now the Trump administration is responsible for this investigation. So you could argue one way or another. If somebody breaks the law, you certainly want to have them be investigated, especially in a prominent position like this. But then there's the question that arises: should she resign before there's evidence presented in a court of law? And that's something that has to be decided by the courts. This is kind of new or unprecedented in a sense. We haven't been down this road before. But what I'll say is we often see political pressure. So I'll go back to the last administration. The difference this time is a lot of it's coming from the president, right? President Trump he's not a bashful person when it comes to what he says. But last administration, if you remember, there was a bit of and this was coming from the Senate, um, there was a push for about stock trading that members of the Federal Reserve did. So there were two Fed Reserve members in 2021 that resigned their positions because they were getting pressured from senators. I think Elizabeth Warren being one of the driving forces there for these folks to resign. And again, there was no evidence of wrongdoing, but there was accusations, just like we have with the current, Lisa Cook. So these two folks resigned. So that's what's a little bit different. A lot of times, and I actually heard one of those that resigned was interviewed on Bloomberg a couple of weeks ago, and he said he did it because he thought it was the right thing to do for the Federal Reserve, that political independence type of thing. So he did resign. This go around, we have the person that's being accused is not resigning. They're staying there, and they're fighting it, right? They're fighting back in the courts, which is what the proper method to do all this is. So we talk about the political aspect of it, and I think Trump, just being Trump, he kind of gets a lot of press time because he says so many things. But it certainly has happened before, and like I said, just in the prior administration. But again, I think in my opinion, Chairman Powell has done a really good job of navigating it. I mean, think about this guy. You've got the president of the United States coming out saying he should be fired.
Yeah.
Powell has not come out and been nasty about it and fought back. He's had some questions in his press conference after FOMC meetings. He said, listen, I'm not going to get involved in this. I don't think I should be fired as not cause or whatever else. But I think Powell has really navigated this in a really positive way. And of course, he hasn't resigned. He's staying there, and he'll be terming out of the Fed chair in May. So he'll still be a member if he wants to be of the board, but he will no longer be chair in May. So he's done a very good job of maintaining that political neutrality, in my opinion. He's navigated it very well, and I think he deserves kudos for that. So,
Okay.
yeah.
Yeah. All right. Well, thank you. So then, Tim, I guess the main question here today is, do you think the Fed is likely to cut rates next week?
If you'd asked me a couple days ago, I'd have said it was more of a toss-up. But with that jobs report that Scott talked about, coming out this morning, I really do. I think they're gonna cut 25 basis points in the September meeting. I just think that a number of things. I think there's evidence that the job market is deteriorating, which some have been talking about for a while. I think based on what we said here, with Powell's speech and Williams coming out and some others talking, I think, that the sentiment is certainly swinging that way. More people are kind of taking notice to that, and also taking notice that, while inflation still isn't where they want it to be, I mean, absolutely, they constantly or have been talking about, Chair Powell's been talking about, their dual mandate being in tension, right? Because where inflation is right now, you would think they'd still want to maintain a bit of a restrictive policy to make sure inflation doesn't get out of control, but yet, you want to protect the job market, and with, some deteriorating data there, you would think you need to reduce rates, and those things are difficult, right? And Chair Powell has said, well, basically the way we solve that is to take a look and see, what we think the worst outcome is for both, right? And I just kind of feel like, based on the data we've seen recently, that, the risks probably are tipping on the side of, if you don't do something, and I don't want to say give the people what they want, right? But the markets are certainly anticipating it. There are more and more talking heads calling for it. There are more and more folks on the Fed that seem to be of the brain that we might be getting to that time. I think if you don't cut in September, and something crazy doesn't happen between now and that meeting, I think it's going to be a real tough explanation as to what it would take for you to, cut 25 bips and at least get started. Let's face it, I mean, it's more of a symbolic cut than anything, right? I mean, 25 basis points doesn't make a ton of difference in anybody's metrics or wallet, right? But it's a fact of the acknowledgement from the Fed that, risks have tipped a certain way. We are going to start this cutting campaign. And that's the big question is, I think everybody's kind of satisfied at this point, particularly after the jobs number this morning, that it is likely that the Fed is going to cut. The big question is what happens after that, all right? Because it took us a while to get here to where we think, there's probably enough data that everybody's going to acquiesce around. Let's cut 25 and see what happens. But what will it take to keep that going? I mean, we're like I said, there's evidence to say, the dual mandate is still in tension. So, I think this is going to be real touch and go. And where in the past you kind of start a rate reduction campaign or a rate rise campaign, you kind of feel like, yeah, we've got some legs to run on this thing, right? And here, I don't know. I mean, uh, I think there's just so much, and we talk about this all the time, right? But there's just so much uncertainty out there that although, I think we'll get a 25 basis point cut this time, I don't think that in any way cements what happens from here on out or when. I think it's still, yeah, okay, so that's done. Let's see what happens. So yeah, I'm thinking 25 in September. I don't know. I'd be interested to hear what Scott thinks. So
Well, I was kind of going to ask Scott, so if the Fed were to choose to hold, because I mean, there's definitely some controversy over whether or not they'll do 25, but it seems like everyone is kind of saying they are leaning towards the 25. But if they were to decide to hold, what language should then we look for in the statement or the press conference that would signal future cuts? And maybe even if they do cut 25, what would signal additional rate cuts this year?
Yeah, so they'll relay a lot in their statement that they were released, but I'm with Tim. I think they're based on what we know today, we a little over a week out from the Fed meeting, I think we're likely to see a 25 basis point rate cut. It seems like it's baked in, as Tim pointed out, the markets are begging for it. The president's begging for it. The economic, the employment data's been weakening, and I think you can make a really strong case of weakening employment data. I saw yesterday article on just recent college graduates really struggling to find jobs. The unemployment rate for recent college graduates, I think they said for the first time ever, is higher than the national unemployment rate. So the national unemployment rate, when they report this, 4.2, 4.3%. The unemployment rate for recent graduates is over 6%. So that's very concerning. You want those younger folks that have just spent 4 or more years in college to come out and get a job. So I think the Fed in their statement is going to have to acknowledge the weakening labor numbers. They're going to have to acknowledge that. And they're going to have to say something to say that right now that is the bigger risk is the employment data takes precedent today over the inflation data and is why they're making that cut and why they may make future cuts, right? As Tim pointed out, and I agree with wholly, it is a tricky situation right now because we were seeing inflation come down, still not at the Fed's 2% target, but we were slowly ticking down. The last 2 or 3 months, it's been slowly ticking up a little bit. Nothing really concerning yet, but the fact that they're going to start cutting rates, that's going to juice the economy a little bit. But if they go on a 150 basis point rate cut over the next 6 or 8 months, that will have an impact on the economy. It'll have impacts on people's mental thinking about things, right? You see this, you start feeling, okay, rates are lower now. I can buy that more expensive car, or actually I can buy a house now. I've been renting. People might be able to afford houses if we see the 10-year come down. So the mentality may change some, but I think it's going to just the main thing we're going to see in the statement is a shift from the balance of risk has shifted more to the employment side of things, that part of the mandate, and that's what we're focused on with this rate cut. But I think, as Tim said, they're probably going to have to keep it a little ambiguous there and say, but we may have to stop this, or we may, potentially have to even raise rates. I don't think we'll see that in this first statement, but leaving that possibility out there because of the inflation aspect, they do have this dual mandate that they feel responsible for. And that's really what we've seen this split over has been, what part of this dual mandate do you want to come out on? So I think they have to acknowledge that inflation is still a concern, but for now, we're focused on the employment side of things. And that's why we have this rate cut We may have some others. And what I'll say is, even with these issues, the consumer's still spending money. Now we do have two camps, right? We have these paycheck to paycheck people that have been struggling for years now, and they still are. But we have seen recent improvement in delinquencies for autos and credit cards, which is a positive sign. But consumers are still spending. The economy is not. I mean, we had a good GDP in the second quarter, over 3%. So the economy is doing pretty well. So this brings up the whole stagflation thing. I don't know that the Fed's going to mention stagflation in their statement, but it seems like we're setting up nicely for a stagflationary environment here, right? Weakening employment and spending that's mediocre but still there, but inflation that's climbing. Probably not going to be in the statement, but certainly on the Fed's mind.
Okay. All right. Well, Tim, you said the word earlier, uncertainty. So how does all this uncertainty affect credit unions, their lending, their pricing, their money management?
Yeah, Jamie. I mean, I think, credit unions and all businesses, I mean, I think it's similar. You always say inflation begets inflation, right? And I think uncertainty is the same way. Uncertainty begets more uncertainty, right? And I think, that's credit unions, that's the consumer, that's other businesses, right? I think, certainly if you're a consumer out there right now, I mean, Scott talked a little bit about it here on for autos and a conundrum around mortgages that people are in. What do you do, right? I think that obviously is affecting decisions that consumers are making around whether they borrow, whether they don't. Do we wait for a rate cut? Don't we? It just makes the decision making for everybody much tougher. Credit unions managing money. It's not too long ago that they got, beat up pretty hard by a Fed that said, hey, rate rises, increases will be low and slow. And then we saw 500 basis points in 15 months and their asset values went, down substantially and liquidity was a problem. And, it's not so long ago that the folks don't remember that. So what do you do now? I mean, we're sitting here talking about, well, yeah, they're probably going to be a 25 base point rate cut, but who knows what's going to happen after that? I mean, what do you do? Do you try and still grab some rate while you can and put it out a little longer? I just think that there's some evidence that that may be a good play if you can still grab some rate while you can, but it's really difficult to make decisions because you just don't have any solid feeling of which way something is going to go. I mean, it isn't too often. Gosh, I don't remember since I've been kind of working with this. I don't ever remember a time where we're saying, yeah, the dual mandate's in tension. We're not sure which way we're going to have to go with the rates. I mean, we're in a very unusual situation to me in the economy, and it just makes it very difficult for anybody to make any good decisions. So I just think it's a great time, for credit unions to remain disciplined, right? This is a good time to make sure that you're looking at your policies, kind of taking stock in where everybody's comfortable, what risks they're comfortable taking. Make sure the board and management is aligned on that. So the moves that you do make, if for some reason they come back to haunt a little bit, at least you had some protocol you were following. Everybody was on board, and you kind of weren't getting swayed by the most recent news or talking head out there, right? So I think it just, it kind of states the obvious. But I think that unfortunately is how it plays out. And, we've been having a debate inside, it's been very oddly liquidity flush lately, right? I mean, even through the summer months here, deposits have stayed, and we've been having the internal talk, a number of us, why is that? What's going on? Why is the money staying? And in talking with credit unions, I know Scott has an opportunity to talk to credit unions a lot. I do, maybe a little less so, but still do. And And what's coming out of everybody's mouth is, typically we see kind of a theme, right? Everybody's saying, yeah, it's getting tougher. People are shopping rates, money's kind of leaving, or they're needing to spend down savings, whatever. And now, it's just all over the place. Some credit unions will tell you I have no trouble making loans. We kind of had to shut it off. Other credit unions saying, gee, I can't make a loan. Some are saying, hey, we see deposits staying and liquidity not being a problem. Some are saying, hey, I'm starting to see stuff leave, and it's very inconsistent. And I think, the uncertainty around the economic environment right now certainly is breeding some of that. So it just makes everything very difficult as far as decision making goes.
Yeah, yeah. Well, thank you both so much for joining me today. Any final thoughts for our listeners from either of you?
Well, I do want to follow up with what Tim said. I think he's right. There's just a lot of uncertainty. I think we're both pretty, it sounds like we're both pretty confident the Fed's going to make a 25 basis point cut at this next meeting. Again, inflation could throw that off, but more than likely they're going to make a cut based on the jobs data. But there's a lot of uncertainty about what they do going forward and at what pace they go. So that we may get a little bit of a clue in the statement about that, but really we'll probably get a lot of that through Fed speak after the meeting when they leave their blackout period and we start to hear from different members of the FOMC. So what I would do is listen to those members when you see the headlines, and it may not be Chair Powell, it may be some other member of regional Fed president or somebody on the board, but listen to those statements and kind of where they're leaning. Continue to watch the data, obviously, but the uncertainty today is how deep does the Fed cut? When I looked the other day, the markets were thinking, oh, this cycle of rate cuts that we think are going to start, they were thinking we could see up to 150 basis points of cuts, and this is going into next year. And then this year, it's one of those, do we see 50 this year? We have 3 meetings left this year. So do we see 50 total? Do we maybe see 75? Is this first cut 50? Maybe 25? I think it's going to be 25. I think the Fed, based on where they've been, is going to start this gradually. But they're going to have to be cautious, as Tim said, because they do have this dual mandate that may keep them from cutting super aggressively as we may expect, in other rate cycles when it's more clear cut. Employment is the concern. We've got to start cutting rates. Our inflation is a concern. We've got to start raising rates. So, yeah, that's the thing. The uncertainty there is certainly something to be aware of, and just I think listening to Fed folks, the members, to hear what they have to say.
Tim, any thoughts?
Yeah, I guess I would just say dittos on Scott. And just to reiterate, as you're managing your money, make sure you're following a plan. Follow a plan that all have agreed upon and are comfortable with. It keeps you out of trouble. It keeps you from chasing that latest shiny thing that somebody's dangling in front of you. So,
all right. Again, thank you both so much for joining me today. And this episode of Financial Minds is brought to you by Vizo Financial's partner, Know Before. The more practice and emphasis you put on security awareness, the better you'll be able to deal with social engineering threats like phishing, and cyber attacks, which is why Vizo Financial has partnered with industry leader Know Before. Their platform uses simulated social engineering testing and security awareness training to help your staff get practice at identifying these threats. Make security a top priority at your credit union with Know Before social engineering testing services. Learn more at www.vfccu.org. As always, thanks for listening and make it a great day.